Hi guys, hope you all doing well and welcome back to our channel. And in this video, I'm going to talk about Saml and Wsfed protocol. Now, since this will be the first video of the entire series that I'm going to create, I'm also going to talk about some of the key fundamentals that you must know and that will help you to have more logical understanding of how exactly things work in a federated environment or what exactly federation is all about and where exactly these two protocols are placed in terms of federation. Third thing that I'm going to talk about will be different parameters used by both of these protocols. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about will be token type. That means when you are using a specific protocol, what kind of token you will get from the identity provider. Before we actually understand what is WSFed and SAML protocol, let's understand the first basic foundational concept, and that is what is federation. Think about a scenario wherein I have an application for which the identity is outsourced to an identity provider. But before even the first request from an application can land to a specific endpoint of my identity provider, what the application developer has already decided is what kind of protocol must be used, what are the claims that are expected, how a request should be generated, what parameters should be included, and what should be the response from the identity provider that should land up to an application. This is how the entire process works. But when you will read the documentation of WSFed and protocol, these two entities, identity provider and resource provider, will be referred as realms. So realm in plain English means boundaries, but think about identity provider and application as two different realms always, because they both have their own authorization model. Now, what do I mean by authorization model? That let me give you an example. In Azure AD, we have conditional access. That means we are defining multiple conditions on behalf of which a user will get access. Similarly, when a token is being consumed by an application can build a logic, or you can define a logic inside your application to check if a specific claim is available for a user, then only allow access. So since both the entities can have their own authorization model, always think about these two entities as different realm altogether. Now, when you will read documentation, one more very common term that you'll come across, and that will be security principle. In a nutshell, security principle means object. I am here referring security principle to a user object, which is a collection of attributes, and all these attribute values in a nutshell will be known as claims in claim-based identity model. If we place our security principle in our realm deck, this is what we can figure out. So think about a scenario that there is an enterprise or there is a realm which has identity provider, and there is a different enterprise or a different realm which is hosting the application, and this application is protecting resources that can be database, that can be APIs, that can be anything. So what we can understand as of now, that the security principle and the resource which a security principle has to access, they both are in different realms altogether. Now, in order to define a way or achieve a method wherein this access can be granted is exactly federation all about. So from a definition perspective, federation means that access to protected resources can be granted to security principle existing in different realms. This is what federation means. Now, this is a very important concept which you must know. That's why I have covered federation, realm, and security principle. Now let's combine all this and understand where exactly WSFed and SAML is placed. So once you have configured everything, this is how exactly the blueprint of your end goal will look like, wherein a user has got the access to protected resources that are existing in different realm altogether. Now let's consider one more scenario wherein, let's say you are the application developer and you have developed a web-based application, which is application.com. Now the moment user uses a browser to go to this particular link, it's your application server that will receive the very first request. Now, it's the responsibility of your application server to check whether the user is authenticated or not. If the user is not authenticated, the request has to be sent to a specific endpoint of your identity provider. Now, it's the responsibility of your identity provider to get the user authenticated and send an acknowledgement back in the form of security token. But what we have to understand, the first mode or the first message that your application will send to your identity provider, letting it know that this user is not authenticated, would be a Wsfed or a Saml request. So in a nutshell, Wsfed and Saml are the protocols that are used by application and identity provider to communicate with each other, and these are also known as sign-in protocols. Now, the values that are used for Wsfed and Saml, they are different altogether. That's the reason the response which you get from an identity provider for both the protocols are different. And all these parameters which are used by these protocols are actually SOAP request, or XML formatted request that is included over HTTPS. Now, why I am saying over HTTPS? Think about a scenario that you have developed a web application. All the traffic will be flowing through HTTPS itself. So how it works, the SOAP request gets encoded with HTTPS, and then these request and response are exchanged between your application and your identity provider. So one more definition that can help you to understand it more clearly, and that is Wsfed and SAML are the protocol used by application and identity provider to receive and send SOAP request response encoded in HTTPS. This is an example of how a SOAP request will look like. It is an XML formatted request that gets embedded in HTTPS, and then it's been sent to either identity provider, or identity provider sends acknowledgement back to your application. Now, in this case, where an application is trying to contact your identity provider, and if your application would have been using Wsfed, this is how the request will look like. And in case of SAML, the parameters value or the header values or the values that are included in the link altogether will get changed. So as you can see that there is a redirect that's your application is actually sending to the user agent, to the browser, and then it's your browser which is going to an endpoint of your identity provider. And if we compare these two values, we can see the difference, but what is common is the endpoint. Now think about, or just try to relate this, that it's your application responsibility to let the identity provider know which protocol is being used. Because think about like this, that in your application you may be using Wsfed, but your identity provider may be capable enough to handle all the protocol requests. So whatever you send in the request, in the first request to your identity provider will respond accordingly. So the first section, which I have already highlighted in red, is the endpoint of ADFS. The other two parameters which we see is WT realm in case of Wsfed and login to RP in case of SAML. The other parameter is WAuth in case of Wsfed and requested authentication context in terms of SAML. Now, if we compare these four parameters, the value of WT realm and login to RP will always remain same because this is the identifier of your relying party. Here I'm taking example of ADFS. So if you go to the relying party trust and go to the identifier tab, you'll find a value. Now it doesn't matter which application is using what kind of protocol, this is the value which will remain same. It's just the header value or the parameter value will get changed. So if you are using an application that has Wsfed, it will be using WT realm. If you are having an application that is using SAML, it will be login to RP, but this value will remain same. The value that you see right now on the screen is the identifier value of ADFS claims X-ray tool. But if we talk about the other header, which is used for authentication method being used, that's actually letting the identity provider know what kind of authentication you should present to the user. So in this case, if my application is sending a redirect to ADFS, the identity provider will prompt for form-based authentication. So this table is a reference point that I'm keeping in this video so that you guys will be able to relate when I will be showcasing all this in Fiddler. But I'll explain you this with one more example, that let's say your application is using SAML and you want certificate authentication to be presented to a user. Then in that case, this is the value that you will be sending in the redirect request from your application to your identity provider. Now, once the request is being received by the identity provider, now it's the job of identity provider to send a response back to your application. Now, in case when you are using Wsfed protocol, the response that you will get will be SAML 1.0 token type, and when you are using SAML, the response that you will get will be SAML 2.0 token type. Now, I will be covering all these responses in a lot more detail when I will be talking about the structure of how the parameters are being included, how different sections are included in both of these response type. These responses which your identity provider is sending to your application are also known as request security token response. So this was all about knowing the theoretical part of how exactly Wsfed and SAML work, how you can just address or how you can just know by looking at the address bar which protocol has been used by an application to send an authentication request to your identity provider. So let's talk about a quick summary about this video. We have discussed about the key fundamentals, we have discussed about different parameters, and we have discussed about token type. In the next video, I'm going to elaborate each and every parameter that you can check in a Fiddler trace that's been sent by an application to an identity provider when it is using either Wsfed or SAML protocol. Now, it requires a lot of research and a lot of time to create every content that you see on our channel. If you are learning something new from our channel, please feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much. Bye bye.